Hi, I'm Jacquie Cohen Roth, founder, CEO of CannabizMD and TPAD. Welcome to another CannabizMD video profile. I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Ruth Fisher, who is an economist and has a technology expert, new technology, and of course, cannabis science data. We're going to hear a lot more about her and what she's been working on. And then I'm very excited with an undergraduate, or actually undergraduate degree in economics as well as policy studies, to geek out on some economics related to the cannabis industry. So welcome, Dr. Fisher, and if you would please, where are you? What are you doing? Where'd you come from into the cannabis industry?
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I, like probably many people, I tried cannabis when I was in college and decided it wasn't really my thing. In college, I was a drinker, but I'm not really a drinker anymore. So I guess kind of the whole recreational aspect of psychoactivity just really isn't my thing. But anyway, I have a long history of working in healthcare and healthcare technology. And it was interesting because I was working on an AIDS case in the early 90s. It was an AIDS drug, and that's when AIDS was a real crisis. And that's
Right.
also when medical cannabis started coming into the news.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember very distinctly at that time thinking, well, medical cannabis, well, if AIDS patients want to get high, if that's going to help them, then I certainly have no objection to that. But I seriously doubt that cannabis has any real medical efficacy. And so I just really dismissed it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, fast forward ahead about 15, 20 years, my brother gets MS, multiple sclerosis, and he has terrible multifaceted neuropathic pain. And he was on all sorts of drugs and still needed a lot more relief than he was getting. And at one point, one of his doctors said, I think medical cannabis might help, but I can't give you any guidance.
Mm-hmm.
So he started using it on his own and really didn't know what he was doing, but just jumped in and started playing around and was getting some results and was delighted by that, but realized that he could probably get a lot better results if he knew what he was doing.
Right.
So at some point, he turned to me as a medical researcher to help him understand cannabis and figure out how to get better effects for his pain. And at the time, I remember thinking, wow, really? Medical cannabis? Well, if he says it works, then really that's all I care about. And so I jumped in from there. I had literally zero information on cannabis, the plant, or its health effects or anything. And I just started reading and started trying
Mm-hmm.
to, get a grasp of what was going on. And I found cannabis to be extremely complex. I'm a medical researcher. I'm just a researcher. I've looked at a lot of different industries and I have good experience in healthcare. And I just found cannabis really difficult to try and understand because there's so many moving parts. There's so much information. There's so much misinformation.
Total, right, absolutely, right, and it's ever changing. We
Yeah.
say as well this is we operate in dog years and probably a bit faster than that sometimes.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I'm feeding my brother tidbits of information and he's incorporating it into his use, and lo and behold, it's working. And so at some point when he's realizing that there's some sort of method to this, as he's an engineer and a photographer, among other things, he came up with an idea for a technology, a matching technology, and asked me to help him with it. So then I really dove into the research and tried to, understand it and put it together in a much more connected way.
Mhm.
And at some point, after having done all this research, my brother said, we put together so much information, we really should compile a book to help other people. So that's what we did. And he has experience in graphic design and photography and everything. And so my content and his graphics, we put together and we released the medical cannabis primer. And we're really excited about that. And we've been promoting it. And since then, I started reading in about 2015 and haven't stopped. And every day I learn tons of new stuff. And the more I learn, the less I feel like I really know. Um, the past couple of weeks, we've been really hard at work creating a course in medical cannabis fundamentals based on our book, and we're putting the finishing touches on that, and we're really excited. But I'm super excited to be in cannabis. And if you had asked me 10 years ago, or if you had told me 10 years ago I'd be doing cannabis, I would have laughed.
I think, many of us have that. I'm 3 weeks and a day, who's counting, away from getting my master's of science in medical cannabis science and therapeutics. And a graduate degree has been a lifetime goal of mine, and I never would have expected, what it is. But it's an incredibly dynamic field and industry, as well as, offer you congratulations on you working with your brother. That's tremendous. A couple questions. How does he treat himself? So we're talking again about he has MS. So there's being treated for spasticity, neuropathic pain, which is really, really challenging.
He,
What's working
MS
best?
manifests in each person differently, and for him
Uh-huh.
to get the pain, he actually had a stem cell transplant. So theoretically, that halted the progression, but he's left damage that to system. So he says it's kind of like if you have termites and you have your house fumigated, then you get rid of the termites, but your life irrigated. So he has a lot of pain, and he's on different pain medications, but he uses cannabis regularly to supplement his other pain meds. And
Mm-hmm.
he currently uses a combination of different tinctures, stronger at night than in the morning. So less psychoactivity in the morning, but he definitely uses combination tinctures, 4-to-1,
Mm-hmm.
1-to-1. So he's getting both cannabis and THC, cannabis, CBD and THC
Mm-hmm.
together. And that's definitely addressing his pain.
And who is the intended audience for the education that you're so close to delivering?
We actually had in mind a figure who we call Betty, who's like a grandma. And, Betty likes to bake and she dotes on her grandkids. And
Uh-huh.
at some point, she has arthritis or something, and her doctor says, maybe medical cannabis can help. Now, of course, Betty grew up with this stigma, and
Right.
it has this big fear of cannabis and a lot of uncertainty and knows nothing about it. And so we wrote the book for Betty to say, okay, here's what's going on, kind of brief summary of the political landscape and why it's
Mm-hmm.
been vilified. And
Right. Excellent.
here, here's what the medical literature actually has to say. And there's a lot of controversy, but there's a lot of bias.
Correct.
And I went in and tried to understand this. And what I'm doing is, or what we're doing is gathering what the experts say together and presenting it to you.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not creating new information. We're not doing studies. This is simply, if you as a consumer, a new user, wanted to go out there and do the research to understand cannabis and how to better use it as a medical user, what would you want to know?
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to put it together in as friendly and non-intimidating way as possible. It's 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 a little sophisticated, but it's not written for a doctor necessarily or a technology person. So it's written for lay people who are new to the whole experience
Mm-hmm.
and want to feel more confident and more empowered with their decision to use cannabis.
Well, excellent. Congratulations on that. So let's dive in. Our audience are physicians, industry professionals, no pun intended, but at a higher level. And so, with your background in economics, so how does that come into play with what you're doing now in the industry, and with Can Dynamics behind you?
That's an interesting question. So economics, some people might know, is also called political economy. And that makes it a little more obvious that politics plays a huge role in the economy. And cannabis probably is one of the most, if not the most regulated uh, industries out
Right.
there. And so what economics does is it understands that the laws and the rules and regulations that the industry is given, and that the different players, the providers, the suppliers, and the consumers are subject to, that will have a massive shaping on the industry and the outcomes as far as how competitive is it, how much access is there to people, what are prices like, are they high, are they low, is there a lot of
Mhm.
variety or not. And again, every decision in cannabis, so for example, how much do you charge as a fee to get a license to sell cannabis, the fact that cannabis is required to be tested, the fact that cannabis can't be delivered through the mail. All of these regulations have massive impacts on shaping the outcomes and what ends up happening,
Mhm.
how suppliers act and how consumers act, and kind of, what ends up happening in the industry.
Yeah, as I said, I was very excited to speak with you. Is that I have policy and economics and a minor in international political economy, so I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
And that taking and gathering that data, forecasting, trending, I just that was the impetus for me deciding to pivot from traditional healthcare solely into the cannabis industry. Was it is a fascinating industry, and to be at with its nascency. It's incredibly exciting. So what, just jumping right in with, we have 18 states where we are today. We're recording this on, what is it, April 15th, what would have been tax day, 2021. 18 states, with the most recent one legalizing adult use, New Mexico. I think within the last week, we've had New York and Virginia. So, what is the impact on the medical cannabis industry as these states become essentially a dual industry?
This is something I've been paying particular attention to,
Mm-hmm.
because I certainly have no objections to recreational use, but I've seen how amazing cannabis is and what potential it has for medical uses. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm particularly passionate about seeing cannabis realize its potential and become as accessible as possible to medical users. And what worries me is that if you look at the trends of adoption of cannabis and kind of what happens over time, what the dynamics
Mm-hmm.
look like, is the states invariably start with medical cannabis. So that becomes legal first.
Right.
So of course, 100% of the legal use at that time is for medical. And then what you see is, as medical cannabis penetrates, you get more patients, you get more cannabis sales, and you get more sales per patient over time. And then at some point, most of the states are now adding recreational. They're legalizing
Mm-hmm.
recreational cannabis. And what you see is, in certain states, they remain in separate markets. So you have
Mm-hmm.
very distinct medical license dispensaries and recreational license dispensaries. But in a lot of other states, in particular in California and Nevada and a lot of the West Coast, what you see is an integration, so that existing medical dispensaries either uh, get a license to sell recreational cannabis, or you see a lot of new entry by dispensaries who then get both licenses. And I think one of the issues here is that it's relatively inexpensive. Once you have one license, you can get the other relatively
Right.
easily.
Right.
So you have
And mhm.
these dual license entities, and you end up with a very, very small fraction of the original dispensaries remain medical only. And the medical only continue, obviously, to cater to medical patients. But all of the other dispensaries that are now dual use, what happens is, over time, the recreational use comes to overwhelm or swamp the medical use. And what that means is you get such an overwhelming demand for rec, and
Mhm.
people come in and they're clamoring for it, that the dispensaries start catering to the needs of the recreational people, and this comes at the expense of the medical people. And specifically, if you look at the types of cannabis that recreational users want, typically they want high THC.
Right.
Typically, they're using it for recreation and they want the psychoactivity.
Mm-hmm.
Medical patients, on the other hand, want don't want just high THC. They want specific combinations of cannabinoids and terpenes as per their medical needs. And so they want this variety. And what happens is all the varieties get squeezed out and replaced with high THC brands. You also see the prices, if the variety is still available, it might come at higher costs. And importantly, really importantly, is in cannabis, most of the people in cannabis are getting their information from the dispensary providers, the bud tenders.
Right, right.
And so it's imperative for medical patients to be able to trust bud tenders and the advice that they're giving them as to use. But as recreational starts to overwhelm medical, the dispensaries no longer really have to focus on making sure their bud tenders are educated in medical uses, because the rec users to an extent, to a large extent, are a lot easier to serve. The people who are out there in recreational dispensaries tend to come from the recreational markets. They're traditional users. And so they understand the recreational perspective, but they don't understand that the medical needs are fundamentally different than recreational needs. And so, this issue of having medical education available to the medical users and having the varieties that they need, that's becoming squeezed out. And if you look at what happens in the trends of patient counts, as recreational becomes legal, the medical cannabis patient counts start to decline over time. And one of the issues here is that in order to have a medical card, you need to apply every year, which means you need to go to a doctor and have him sign off on getting you a medical card, and then you have to apply for the medical card. Whereas, so you go through all this rigmarole to get a medical card, and that does give you some benefits, but why not just go to the dispensary? As a recreational patient, you have access to all the same products. Some places you pay slightly higher, but of course you don't have to pay for your medical card or the doctor's visit or whatever. And so really what the studies are concluding is this massive drop in medical use is because medical patients are transitioning over to and becoming in name recreational,
Right.
but they're still using it for medical uses. And
What? So, familiar with some strategies that to keep them, separate, so to speak, and or not just definitively separate. Is one is the tax structure, and so that recreational is taxed period. Where, for example, I'm in Maryland. It is a medical state, as I say in theory. That's we're going to talk about that in a bit, but that it's not taxed. And so, do you see that as a strategy to continue to keep bolster and support the medical industry?
I think taxes, it's taxes play a huge role, but it's also regulations. And what I'm looking at here is, in order to encourage the medical patients to go through the burden of seeing a doctor and getting a medical card, it has to be worth their while. And right now, so for example, in California, if you're a medical patient, you're not subject to sales tax, but you are subject to excise taxes.
Right. It's a
Sales tax,
use tax, yeah. A
sales
sin
tax,
tax, yeah.
yes. Sales tax is roughly 8%, and the excise taxes are 35%. And
Significant.
then, yes. And then the problem is, if you go to the East Coast and if you look at the places that are focusing more on medical, the East Coast in general tends to be more vertically integrated. And there tend to be, to the extent it's possible, it tends to be more restrictive on the East Coast than it is on the West Coast. In other words, the cost, all the costs in terms of all the licenses and the compliance costs and everything puts a huge burden on the suppliers, and they have to jack up their prices and charge really high prices in order to cover their costs and be profitable. So even if you're talking about medical dispensaries, even if they give them a tax break, you still have all the compliance costs that they need to comply with in order to adhere to the laws. And those costs are really expensive, like 280E. The fact that suppliers of cannabis can't write off a lot of the normal costs of doing business means they're paying taxes on a huge portion of their sales, whereas most people just paid on income, they're paying it generally on sales. And so you have the tax burden, you have all the security burden, you have huge advisory burden, the legal and accounting fees that they pay in order to, again, comply with all the regulations, make it really expensive. And again, they're passing on all these costs to consumers. So even if it is, they're catering to medical consumers, the price to the consumer ends up being really high. And of course, currently, there's no FDA, there are very few approved FDA drugs, which means insurance isn't covering them. So all of this becomes out of pocket.
Do you think, as these, with home grow, so that what I have been studying and what I know is that as the states legalize adult use, they're also, for the most part, legalizing a maximum of 6 plants per per consumer. I think it's adult. Generally, it's adult in the house, and of course, there's regulations around how those plants are maintained, where they are, etc. Um, is that a threat at all to the industry? This is providing, as you said, patients is that to have access at far more reasonable cost to their medicine.
Right.
And we know the history of moonshine and making your own, right? So, grown-ups should be able to grow their own medicine. And again, so the question being, any impact on the industry as states become adult use?
It's interesting. I have a very good friend uses cannabis, a lot of cannabis for her traumatic brain injury,
Mm-hmm.
TBI. And cannabis has literally saved her life, and she uses a lot. And so she said, well, I have to try and grow it. And so she's been trying to grow it, and man, I have to laugh now after hearing about her experiences. Everyone out there, you read the stuff, well, people can just grow their own. Well, it turns out it's not trivial.
It's
So
complex. It is.
very complicated.
Yeah.
And in particular, when you're talking about a cannabis plant, a medical user, so say you come in for arthritis or pain or anxiety, you're looking for different profiles of plants. And so you say, okay, you want a certain profile for, say, pain. And
Mm-hmm.
so you can find a plant with the right genetics and grow that plant at home. But what the profile that ends up being in the plant is also shaped by the environment.
Right. And the
It's
growing
hugely
medium.
shaped,
Right.
which means
Yeah.
not only do you have to get the right genetics, the right strain, but you also need the right lighting and the humidity and the temperature. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, gosh, the rigmarole. I have a black thumb anyway. I could never grow my own. And so trying to grow it and process it, it's really, it's not easy. And so to trivialize it by saying, well, people can have their own plants, that really doesn't address the primary problem here.
Mm-hmm. You and I, in a previous conversation, were speaking about the different lanes within the industry. And so I had suggested 3 lanes where you have the wellness, which would be CBD, medical, what we've been speaking about, and what we just kind of dabbled in, as you referenced, is something like Epidiolex, Sativex, which are the pharmaceutical products that are FDA approved. So that's the pharma lane. You suggested a 4th lane, right? Yeah. So
So
if you,
I I take a bit of issue with the CBD lane.
uh
So
huh.
I understand the appeal of CBD, and really what CBD is out there, and it's so big because it's technically legal, and it became legal with the Farm Bill. But what the Farm Bill did is previous to the Farm Bill, the whole plant was illegal. And then what the Farm Bill did in 2018 is it took the THC and separated it from the rest of the plant. And the THC remained illegal, but the rest of the plant became legal. And now because it's legal, it's much less regulated and it's much easier to supply. And so all these people wanted to cash in on this new industry
Right.
and seeing medical effect. Now I'm not saying the effects are exaggerated, but it's not like the miracle that a lot of people are claiming.
Exactly.
There's a lot of
Exactly.
hype around it. There's now, again, there's a basis behind the hype, but it's being overhyped. It's also being distinguished from THC. I think what people are doing is they understand that there's a stigma with the plant, and what they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do is distance themselves from the stigma. by saying it's CBD, it's not THC.
This is to your Betty, is that I've had the experience. I was in DC this weekend and guest on a podcast where I was at a great coffee art, really unique space in a very a strong African community, African American community, and there was somebody, a physician, actually a pediatrician no less, who was espousing the benefits of CBD. And when I had the opportunity to speak, I tried to, absolutely was it, encouraging and her enthusiasm. But what we have, consumers had to be so mindful of, our, the regulations are there in place to keep people safe.
Yeah.
And what we have that is a hot topic within the industry, where because of this gray area, is Delta 8, which is very, very scary. As I say, this is a product that's formulated with petroleum, which should be in your car, not in your brain. So, yeah. So back to these, the impact of CBD.
There's another really, really important aspect to this as well. So as I said, CBD is regulated very differently from THC.
Right.
CBD is not required to be tested for safety.
Right.
All they have to test to make sure the THC levels are low enough, but they don't need to test for any pesticides or residual solvents or toxic metals or any other toxins in the plant. Whereas THC products are regulated differently and they're all required to be tested. And so when you buy a CBD product, everyone's saying how wonderfully safe it is. Well, but it's not. And they're finding, I don't want to make it sound like they're really unsafe. Maybe, some of them might be, but in particular, if you look at the content, they're finding that a huge portion of the products out there don't contain what the labeled contents are. Some don't contain CBD at all. And so while it's less safe because it doesn't have the psychoactive component, it's not necessarily. The other thing is when you're talking about health and wellness, it's really CBD and THC together that are the power couple.
Right.
And I just read yet another study yesterday that said if you take CBD isolates versus extracts or whole plant extracts, you need to take about 4 times as much of the isolate in order to get the same effects that you could get by taking just 22.5% of that dose of an extract. And because you're taking much less when you take an extract, you're getting fewer side effects. And so just in general, it's the whole plant thing.
Right. We're talking about the inclusion, as you said, THC, cannabinoid, some minor secondary cannabinoids, as well as the terpene. So I actually apologize. I steered us away from talking about the 4 lanes. So let's get back to the 4 lanes.
Yes. So I think there'll be a wellness. Start separately. There'll be a rec market, and then there'll be a wellness. And wellness will be kind of like the supplement industry now. It will be less regulated. I think it really should be more regulated in the sense that you need to have this testing to make sure it's pesticide free, for example, and that the labeled contents are what they claim to be. But I think that this wellness category is going to be like the supplements category, that anyone with non-critical health effects will be using this less regulated industry. And that includes pain, anxiety, insomnia, everything that people are using supplements for right now. And they do need some level of regulation to make sure they're safe, but they're different from people who are using it for cancer or for epilepsy, who really have much more dire situations. So if we talk about the health and wellness, and we think about supplements right now, supplements are very affordable. They're not covered by healthcare. And I think that we need a little bit more regulation than we have now for supplements for the cannabis market, but not too much regulations that it ends up pushing the prices up beyond affordable for patients. Because I think it's really not tenable for healthcare companies to reimburse for cannabis for wellness. And so if they're not going to reimburse, then we need to keep the prices low, which means we can't have too much regulation. On the other hand, if you're talking about the more critical uses, you need more efficacy and you certainly need absolute safety. Those need higher regulations. And so the prices are going to be a lot higher. But if they're going through all these regulations, they should be able to be healthcare insurance reimbursed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that there's going to be these three lanes, that there's going to be the more strict kind of critical FDA associated types of products that are going to be reimbursed. There's going to be the wellness industry that's CBD and THC and anyone who's using it for non-critical uses. And then there's going to be the rec market.
Mm-hmm. And how about devices that the hardware paraphernalia is
Yeah.
getting very sophisticated. I'm excited that a product that or a device that I've been recently introduced to that has, you're able to measure dosage. It will work simultaneously with an app. The
Yes.
healthcare provider is involved, so they're
Yeah.
recommending and controlling the dosing and then getting that feedback,
Yeah.
as well as in the patient's feedback on what the effects are. Um, any other technology that you're seeing at the forefront now, or that and what should be developed?
The cannabis industry, and especially from the perspective of traditional healthcare providers, has a number of serious limitations. So one of the biggest is consistency. And that means that, when physicians prescribe, say, Prozac or codeine or whatever, they know that when the patient gets that bottle, that it's going to be exactly the same product from dose to dose and bottle to bottle. And in cannabis, every product you buy is slightly different. If you're talking about an extract, and I believe in the whole plant extracts because of the entourage effect,
Mm-hmm.
but the cost of getting that greater variety and variation in ingredients is lack of perfect consistency. And so you have a lot of technology coming out in terms of cultivation techniques to help growers maintain as controlled an environment as possible, so that the strains or the products that the plants are cultivating are as consistent as possible from plant to plant. So they're increasing the consistency in the batches.
Right, and to that end, I'm familiar with companies that are developing cultivars that are specific to treat a disease or disorder.
Right. But as I said earlier, it's not just the genetics, it's the grow environment. And there's
Mm-hmm.
a ton of technology
Right.
coming around the grow environment
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that is stable and consistent. Now, another issue that doctors have a big problem with is, well, I'll go to the third one, which is bioavailability.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big problem in cannabis, because especially if you're taking an edible, which is most
Right.
people, if you take a gummy, or if you take a capsule, which is more like traditional healthcare, the
Mm-hmm.
bioavailability is really, really low. And there's a ton of different formulations and delivery mechanisms, new technologies coming out in both of those areas. Everyone's trying to increase the bioavailability in cannabis. Oh, and then the third, as you mentioned, is doctors are really concerned about making sure patients can get accurate dosing, so they can
Mm-hmm.
get a consistent dose from, like taking a puff. What is a puff, and how many cannabinoids in a puff of a joint? That you
Right.
can
Right.
really measure. And so again, there's a lot of technologies coming out to help more precisely meter and
Mm-hmm.
dose cannabis. And
Mm-hmm.
what fascinates me, being an economist, and I'm actually a free market economist, I recognize there's a role for government, but I definitely lean towards free markets. Is, when I first started getting into cannabis, I recognized from a medical perspective that cannabis had serious limitations, and especially these three that I mentioned. And what's amazing to me is all of the activity that's addressing all of these shortcomings. And so it's human ingenuity. They're seeing that there are flaws, and they're really doing a fantastic job of really trying to address the flaws and make cannabis as close to a traditional medicine as possible.
That goes to a regulatory policy question about the intellectual property, being able to uh, secure, as you develop a cultivar.
That's Yes, it's challenging because it's very difficult to patent a plant.
Yeah.
The reason pharma is so successful is because they come up with a synthetic that they can patent and then take through the FDA approval process. And having a patented FDA approved drug enables you to generate revenues to pay for all the development of the drug. And in cannabis, if it's very difficult to patent a natural plant,
Mm-hmm.
then you don't have any protection. And so that's a real conundrum there. Now, as I said, people are playing around with delivery mechanisms. If you come up with a delivery mechanism, you can patent a delivery mechanism together with the product being delivered. And so generally it's kind of like software. It's hard to patent software, but you can patent software if you also have hardware with it. So in cannabis, a lot of people are trying to get around this patentability problem, although it still remains a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But they're getting around it by changing formulations. So for example, again, making it more bioavailable,
Mm-hmm.
making more targeted delivery, making more bioavailable delivery. So they're modifying the natural plant to make it patentable. But again, the fact that you can't patent cannabis means that there's no large scale research on just plain cannabis because no one can monetize. So the community of research that you see in so many other areas just doesn't exist for cannabis because of the fact that no one can patent the natural plant.
Yeah, well, and that's a great segue into what I'd like to wrap up with is research. So that the limitations, extraordinary limitations on cannabis research because of its current status of a Schedule One drug. What do you think? Where the industry was very helpful, cannabis advocates with the Biden administration, and what Vice President Harris was saying. We now have Biden's pick for head of the DEA. Her name isn't coming to mind right now, but she was Attorney General from New Jersey, and has had in the past said some positive things about cannabis. So, what do you think of the future? In the next 10 years, while this current administration has control.
I think there's a couple of big problems with the research. So first of all, the endocannabinoid system was discovered in the early 90s, but it didn't really start to gain recognition into the early 2000s. So any research done before that was done without a fundamental understanding of how cannabis is working in the body or the complexities. Cannabis is being called a promiscuous drug because it acts on so many different receptors and pathway systems. It's very complicated. And without having any sort of understanding of that complexity, it's hard to design good and valid research. They're doing a much better job now. The more that we understand about the endocannabinoid system, the better the research is becoming. At the same time, there's a little understanding as far as the complexity of the plant. So again, in traditional healthcare, the community is used to dealing with isolates, and isolates are much less complicated, and you get a lot more control over what's going on. Cannabis is the beauty of cannabis comes in its extract whole plant form, which means that you're having a multiplicity of active ingredients all together in one therapeutic. And that doesn't fit very well into the traditional system. You have a lot less control. Doctors are worried about all of the unpredictable effects. And perhaps one of the the most dire issues in cannabis is because the plant is so complex and unique. Every sample is different, but if you go to a cannabis dispensary, for example, you'll see a tremendous, as I said before, the market is stepping up as far as innovation goes, and the variety and the quality of the cannabis in any given dispensary out there is literally stunning. If you look at the regulatory and the research world, in order to do research on cannabis, you're required to go through a federal supplier. There's currently one supplier of cannabis, which is the University of Mississippi. And that they have really, really, really crappy.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
And in fact, I've heard people remark that the cannabis being supplied from Mississippi wouldn't pass the regulations required for cannabis in the regular market. And so if researchers could just go down to their local dispensary
Right.
and get product there, then that would set things forward, a huge amount.
I mean, and
Because
this is, yeah, it's not apples to apples. It's research
no,
of what
so
patients and consumers are using and what this, I've seen photographs of it. It looks horrible. It's
right.
brown, and it just doesn't look like anything that's on the market,
Right.
whether it be
So
medical or recreational.
if
Yeah.
you look at the research is done using this unnatural cannabis product, and it's done under unnatural laboratory conditions. And cannabis in the real world is being used as a natural plant in its whole plant form, benefiting from all the rich combinations of compounds in its proper setting, where people are encouraged to be relaxed and have easy expectations. It's not a sterile environment. Set and setting in cannabis is really important. It's going to shape the outcomes. If there's fear and anxiety, that's not going to help with the outcomes. And if you look at then, so the research environment, you're conducting it using this unnatural form of cannabis, the University of Mississippi, and it's done in this unnatural sterile lab environment. I think that the researchers need to figure out that the regulations need to change so that the researchers can do more better apples to apples comparisons, as you just said.
Right. And so is that Schedule 2? Is that
Um, I think it should be descheduled altogether. I think with
yeah.
other schedules, you're just introducing other complications and restrictions.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Well, we
the Schedule 1, even the Schedule 2, if you look at cannabis is not directly responsible for any deaths. It's
right.
way less lethal than so many other drugs out there.
Right.
And it's used as an alternative. It's used by people who want to use a safe drug, on their own.
Yes.
So the whole scheduling, I think, is political. And I think, the healthcare industry, I understand doctors' perspectives. My dad was a private practice physician. And as I mentioned earlier, I grew up with this stigma, and I can understand kind of the fear, the environment they grew up in, plus not, their malpractice insurance, their liability insurance, the lack of peer support. These are all really, really important issues. But the reality is that people have been lied to, and cannabis isn't as dangerous as people think. And I think that we just need more education. We need more lax regulations for doctors to be able to understand truly what cannabis has to offer.
No, thank you. Well, so that's where we began was education. We started our conversation. So, well, thank you so much for your time and joining me for a Cannabis MD video profile. Look forward to following and seeing what you're doing. Congratulations on the book with your brother, and of course, Can Dynamic. So, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.